song Don't Go Back to Sleep is produced on an album called Ruby by Erica Ferreira and Lisa Ferreira and Erica Lusite, I think it is. I'm not exactly sure on her last name. The reason I picked the song is that it was inspired by the poet Hafiz. And one of the things about Hafiz, the notion of don't go back to sleep, the point of today's talk is about awakening. And I want to focus on 3 areas, 3 ways to awaken, 3 paths to awakening. That call, don't go back to sleep, is an inverse to how many calls there are to going back to sleep. To sit down, to settle in, to settle for, or to set yourself for things that really have very little interest for us, but they are promoted so strongly that the outer world just wants to compel us into things. How many commercials are there? How much money is spent on commercials to have us suddenly believe that this product will make all the difference? And we can be lulled because we keep receiving them. I was saying to Mykal the other day that I just get so many panicky emails about that action must be taken. And if I just read this one more thing about this one more person, or I hear one more, there is this urgency. But in fact, what the urgency can also do is it can put us to sleep. It can lull us. It can be all of this noise that prevents us from listening to spirit that's inside. So what I want for us is to consider 3 particular paths for awakening. 3 ways that we can evolve as people. That we can emerge from where we've been and be conscious about where we're going. Rather than simply meandering about on our way and never really get anywhere. So the 3 things we're going to be looking at are the notions around connecting, around cooperating, and around caring. Now that whole first zone of connecting, science was formulated by creating a disconnect. The brilliant mathematician, scientist, and philosopher Descartes, the one famous for I think, therefore I am, because he could reflect on himself, it told him that he existed. Descartes' work established a whole foundation for science to move forward. He was moving out from literally the Dark Ages. He was a preeminent force in the Enlightenment, in the movement out of just settling for the way things were, just settling for what you were told and doing what you were told and sticking with what you're told. Now, Descartes gets a bad name because Descartes did something that has annoyed people. He made a deal with the devil, and he agreed that he would only apply scientific method to the physical world. And the church could have the spiritual world. So they made a deal and they divided it into 2 separate, distinct areas for exploration. There is what is physical, and there's what is spiritual. And the church felt very satisfied by this because they felt like, well, the spiritual is the only thing that matters. But Descartes and his crew and his thinkers became very excited because they thought, great, that's fine, but we can now do all of this work that could never before be done. But the problem was that then everything that existed became emptied of what was spiritual. And we literally came into a world without soul. a world where we could dissect and dissect and dissect and dissect, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. We could separate. But there was nothing of heart in it. I mean, one of the big notions was that emerged out of this in psychology was Skinner's black box, that there really is no human being. There's just a program. You set this person up, and they get programmed, and they're just these behaviors, and that is what it is to be human. Now, anybody that's ever practiced behaviorism knows that people don't exactly function the way that the behaviorism said it would work. So the very foundation where this all led in terms of saying, we've got to figure it out, there doesn't need to be a soul, didn't figure it out. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that we all embody this notion of separation. It's just a way we move through the world. I don't know about any of you, but I do know for sure about me, I started inside of another person. There is something about becoming human that really requires other humans. We don't just pop up one day. We emerge socially. You know, and there had to be two people that contributed to that being that I am. I had to have a biological mother, and I had to have a biological father. Now, except for the rare cases of people like Jesus, who are said to have been virgin-born, there were a couple of Egyptian figures who were similarly virgin-born. So I found that there was a struggle because we start very socially embedded, and then we're driven to separation. We get sent out of that safe little world, and then we spend the rest of our lives seemingly alone. And that was one of the endpoints of Descartes' message, that we are fundamentally individual, that we are fundamentally alone. And I remember a great deal of my adolescence, my journey through college, my journey into graduate school was coming up against that notion of fundamental individualism. And the either-or choice that seemed to exist when I was studying. Are we fundamentally social, or are we fundamentally individuals? I think that one of the better ways to see this, rather than connection or disconnection, separation or wholeness, is to realize that we operate along a continuum. So my invitation with relationship to connection is just for us to be observing when and how we're connected. Now, I think most of us are acutely aware when we are alone and when we are separated. We can feel separated when we see something that is just profoundly disturbing to us. We hear something, we hear, I don't know, a politician say something, and we might not want to feel a connection with the words or the actions that that politician may make. I'm not naming any politicians because you can select your own, you could have your own little card that you could put on your dance page that fit for you, that say, I really do want to be an individual because I don't want any part of that. I do not want to be connected to that. The awareness is recognizing how we act in that disconnection. Do we put ourselves in a position of judgment? Do we put ourselves in a position of, I am so much better? Do we put ourselves in a position of tuning out, tuning off, not paying any more attention? What is it we do when the process of separation starts to happen? How do we respond? How do we observe ourselves? How do we pay attention to what is going on for us? Again, I remember it was so important to me. I think every one of the papers I wrote in college somehow linked back to the notion of being fundamentally social. And I have to admit, part of it is that I'm a really outgoing kind of person. Extroversion, when I took the Myers-Briggs, there were introverted questions, and I think I scored 0 on that component. They're just, in terms of the scale, I was so far out to the extroversion end that the notion of being alone was just like, why? How could that happen? Now, Jung, who came up with the whole idea of introversion and extroversion, identified that adult functioning is about unifying these things. So now when I run, most of the time I'm running alone. And I'm not looking for people. I'm not like out here, can I find someone? I'm just out with me. In that process of connection, in that process of separation or wholeness, just be watching. Where are we? How do we bring balance to that? How do we awaken ourselves to the ways that we separate ourselves? How do we awaken ourselves to the way that we connect ourselves? How do we pay attention? The tool I'm giving you is to just be paying attention to that process. Is this a process where I'm more connected, or is this a process where I'm more disconnected? What am I feeling about that connection or that disconnection? When a certain someone says something, do I put myself in a position of judgment so that I can separate myself? Do I put myself in a position of loving kindness? It's not always easy, loving kindness. And in that difficulty of loving kindness, there can also be loving kindness with ourselves about the fact that we're really struggling with loving kindness. May you be filled with loving kindness. Sure, may I be filled with loving kindness, but I don't know about that person. I don't know that I want loving kindness for that person, and I don't know that I want to treat that person with loving kindness because I'm not observing any loving kindness. Sometimes that whole idea that we've got to give something to somebody that they do not seem to or appear to have any semblance of can be very challenging. So let's just be aware of that challenge that comes up for us. The second area to look at is the notion of cooperation. I was very fortunate in graduate school. I worked with a student of a psychologist, a social psychologist, Emmy Pepitone, and she was a student of Kurt Lewin. And Lewin was originally from Germany. Emmy Pepitone was originally from Germany. She was a Jewish woman who had fled Germany in time so that she avoided the Nazi camps. But her family members were involved in the Nazi camps. Kurt Lewin talked about the notion of fields. Hafiz identified out beyond the field of right and wrong, I'll meet you there. Kurt Lewin's ideas of there being fields, that we put ourselves into social groupings. And within those different social groupings, our behaviors may change. Has anyone here ever found that when they are at one place, they act a little differently than when they're at another place? Yeah. And that who they are is not always consistent. And it can be very unsettling when we observe ourselves and we even ask, why am I saying this? I had a friend of mine, a speech-language pathologist, and she said, you know, Vaughan, you do a fascinating job with case switching. When you are at the school, you can come across as the straightest guy around. And yet when you're at the Seattle Men's course, you can be as faggy as possible. She said that case switching, you know, and I hadn't really paid attention. I didn't know I was so faggy at the Seattle Men's course. However, I use that illustration of myself being very straight and very fat, with the notion that in the fields where we find ourselves, we can switch. Now, I talk about fields because one of the big works that Kurt Lewin inspired was the whole notion of cooperative learning. And cooperative learning really is the way that education is done nowadays. There are still features, though, of competitive learning. You might have heard them. There's the valedictorian. And I say the valedictorian because it's the person that gives the speech. It's one. And there's the salutatorian. However, I have to say it's very interesting because at our daughter's school, Holy Names, they would have dozens and dozens of salutatorians. And they would have multiple valedictorians because they, I would say the feminine, recognized that we aren't going to just identify a single one. We're going to identify the work of all. So while there's a pull towards competition, and again, we are in the thick of elections. I don't know about you, but elections is a prime example of competition. Who is going to get the most votes? It's very simple. How do I get the most votes? How do I get the most people who go out for it? There are times that we may find ourselves in a competitive situation. How do we, again, observe that extent to which we're called into a competitive way of being? How do we lovingly and kindly be with ourselves in those competitive places? I remember being really frustrated with my daughter Emily because when she was applying for jobs, she was very hesitant to compete to get the job because she's so empathic that she just was not willing to say, I'm better than anyone. And she was in the field of information technology, and it was very important to identify what made her special. For the most part, jobs are not going to hire you unless there's something special about you. And you need to say what it is. You need to have what it is that you're really good at. She went for a long time struggling with that whole notion of saying, I'm really good at this. And she was. This is a young woman who had led the a cappella singing group that she was part of. She had put on hundreds of performances. She had brought in a national group to perform at Dartmouth that had performed for people all through New England. I don't know, that seems kind of big to me. She was someone who, with her undergraduate thesis, was invited to go back and do presentations for an all-women's conference for information technology. She'd come up with a different way to look at medical records and put that information together. And yet, this was a person who wasn't wanting to say, this is who I am, this is what I've done. We can be hesitant to compete. We may be hesitant to cooperate. I know that there are times that I have found myself in groups where I do not feel that my colleagues are carrying their weight. Now, I only say this because, this is probably just me judging, and none of you have ever thought, these deadweights with me are going to keep me back. No, you people are all too evolved, but I will at least demonstrate my own lack of development, that there were times that I just wanted to beg, please take me out of this group, please just let me do this on my own. That can be the cost of cooperation. That we can be stuck with people that we just don't feel are doing all that much. And we can feel like we're climbing walls. The invitation here, again with this notion of cooperation and competition, is just to observe ourselves. In the thick of competition, how are we judging ourselves? How are we moving in it? In the call to cooperation? How much are we giving? Now, I know one coping mechanism for me with cooperation was just to take on the whole project. And to do it independently. And then to give everyone the credit. Oh yeah, they did this. Well, what did they do? Well, we met. We met and we did this here and now. Can we observe our own ease or dis-ease with our ownership in something? How willingly are we letting it go versus wanting to claim it? That little competitive me that's still around comes out. The notion is that we are neither all competitive or all cooperative. I would have to say that if the human spirit did not find excitement with the notion of competition and cooperation, that we wouldn't have these terms. Every 2 years there are Olympics, and there is a winner. There is a gold medal. There is a silver medal. There is a bronze medal. And there are people who are tisk-tisking for that bronze medal. You only got the bronze. It's very disappointing. Look at you. Gold was there, but not for you. Are we willing to give ourselves bronzes and accept it with grace? Are we willing to take the judgment that our bronze isn't good enough? Just observe. Just pay attention. And when we cooperate, are we willing to give with an open heart and open hands? If we see that someone isn't cooperating in a way that we think they should, this is what cooperation means, and you do this. And you're not living up to your this. You know, I have had a complaint about a certain person who has some power over my life about how they are a micromanager, detailing everything. I get it. They want it to be the way they want it to be. My judgment of their wanting it to be that certain way really isn't helping the situation. They're such a micromanager. It's not bringing a very cheerful or kind spirit to the setting. So how do I catch myself and bless rather than curse, or rather than be all nice to the face, but then behind the back being cruel? Watch the competition, watch the cooperation. Just observe. And then choose. How do I want to be here? Where do I want to go with this? Now the last area, care. Compassion. It takes more energy to be compassionate than it does to let somebody go by. Hebrew tradition, which the Christian figurehead Jesus used, tells the story of a traveler Traveler is abducted, beaten up, left to die. The high priest sees it and walks on by. Compassion takes a lot of time. That priest had things to do. There were rituals that needed to be performed. There were ceremonies that needed to be performed. If that person stopped for that person that had been beaten up on the road, they would not have been able to fulfill their duties. Now, it's very easy to judge that person and say, well, what kind of high priest is that person? Bad high priest. Nasty high priest. Next one that came by was the, it's kind of like the district attorney, you would say in nowadays terms. Walks by, but he's got a very important court date. And if he misses this very important court date, this criminal could end up being freed. So, that district attorney walks on by. What a nasty person. They say they are for the law, but here they are passing it by. You know, the person that stopped is the Samaritan. Now, Samaritan, that would be if you're a Democrat, you know, the party manager had walked by, the person with the buttons had walked by, and it's going to be the Republican who stopped and helped you up. Similarly, if you're a Republican, it would be the little Democrat that had helped and stopped you up. We've become such a polarized nation. The notion of the Samaritan is, this was the worst of the worst. Who is the worst possible person? But the worst possible person is the one that helped that person. The Samaritan had people to see and things to do, but they stopped. It's so easy in this story to judge the first two that went by. And it's so easy to be prejudiced from that lack of compassion that the first two had, to be then struck by our prejudice. Who do I most align with, and who do I least align with? And the person I least align with is the person who's the one I should be most like? Ah! Compassion can completely turn our lives around. Sometimes we just think compassion is always going to be this good feeling. I'm doing this compassionate thing and it's just moving me through. In that story, the Good Samaritan, we don't hear that the Good Samaritan is the bubble over that person's head. Oh my God, this is the person who beat up my family 2 weeks ago. This is the person that made sure that passed a law that I shouldn't even be allowed on this road. Fortunately, they were voted down, but that's who I'm helping. But it's a person, and I'm going to take care of it. Compassion isn't easy. And the reason that I'm retelling that story is that it's very easy to judge the two that went by. It's very easy to say the hypocrisy that is guiding their lives. Again, I don't know that anybody here is guilty of this, but I find myself really annoyed by hypocrisy. And yet the problem with hypocrisy is that when I look in the mirror, I know there are times that I have been hypocritical. So the thing about it, the thing is this, that a blatant hypocrite is so easy to get enraged about. Because I can project all of my stuff, all of my own hypocrisies onto that person. And then they become a fabulous scapegoat. How do I stop putting my stuff on the scapegoat? Compassion is the place where I can watch myself and decide, how do I move forward? So again, we see something, we are called to act. We are balancing it in the midst of all the other things that we're called to do. Sometimes it may mean stopping. Sometimes it may mean going on. Only we can judge what's going on. It's not about making up excuses. It's not about explaining it. It's about having a sense of the divine within that is leading us. So again, my invitation for us to awaken, my invitation for us to evolve, is to be watching ourselves in terms of those three areas. My connection, my separation. How am I with that continuum? My competition, my cooperation. Where am I on that? And my compassion. My compassion that is all-encompassing to the world, my compassion that is all-encompassing to myself. Where am I with it? How is it taking my time? How is it taking my energy? And how do I let it move through me so that I awaken? And my awakening and your awakening is something that inspires and awakens others. And so it is.
So it is. So it is.